What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of the Zero Hedge Podcast. I am back here with David Stockman, and we've got a lot going on into the news that I'm looking forward to break down with you guys. So firstly, David, it's great to have you back on the show.
Great to be with you, and you're right. It's flying at us from all directions, so there's a lot to talk about.
All right, so just to kickstart the things to break down, Donald Trump, he loves celebrating a win, even when it seems like there's no win there or when it's a little bit too early to be celebrating. But obviously, his tariffs have been implemented, and the administration is already going, look at all the revenue that we're raising. So this was an Axios headline. I've seen numbers as high as 125 billion. This was claiming $100 billion in revenue. Is the tariff strategy working, and is the revenue that's coming in from the tariffs something we should be excited about?
Well, actually, I don't object to the tariff revenue that much. We've got a 6-7% of GDP deficit. Okay, that's 2.5, 3 trillion a year. We need to basically and fundamentally cut spending drastically. They haven't done this. The big beautiful bill really, I think, is a big but ugly budget buster. But in that mix, a little revenue from tariffs is just a clumsy form of consumption tax, which I think if we're going to raise revenue, that would be the way to do it. Now, what I object to about the Trump administration is they don't see it primarily as a revenue raising tool, which if you did, you would apply it uniformly across the board to everybody. You wouldn't dislocate and perturb the import market. It's 3.5 trillion a year. So, if you put on a 10% across the board revenue tariff, as they used to call it in the 19th century, that'd be 350 billion a year into the Treasury. That's that would be a help to closing this gap. I would even make it 20%. That's 700 billion, and then I would add a 50% cut in defense, another 500 billion, and then a big means test on Medicare and Social Security and other parts of the welfare state. You could generate another 500 billion, and you would begin to close the gap. So that's okay. But I don't think they're taking the revenue gain as a kind of after the fact windfall, but that's not their real purpose. Their real purpose is they think they can change the fundamental structure of the US economy with tariffs. And I think that's a terrible idea. The problem is not that Japan is cheating or even China is cheating or they have high tariffs and we need to even the playing field and all that. That's a lot of baloney. It's not even, we can get into some of the facts, it's not even remotely correct. The reason we have a massive 1 trillion a year trade deficit and have had one for 30, 40 years is the Fed has inflated the bejesus out of the domestic economy. And as a result, on a cumulative basis over decades and decades, our prices, our wages, and our cost structure has gotten uncompetitive with much of the rest of the world economy. And as a result, our exports have been weak and imports have flooded in. And if you want to fix the problem, you don't have to have a trade war with Beijing 10,000 miles away. You ought to clamp down on the source of the problem, which is about 4 blocks from the Oval Office, namely the Eccles building in the Federal Reserve. That's the problem. They have run a pro-inflation policy for decades, and it's finally almost put the U.S. economy out of business. So Trump is right that we can't live with $1 trillion a year trade deficit. He's right that we've offshored a good chunk of our industrial economy and good paying jobs, but you're not going to tariff your way back to a solution. You've basically got to attack the problem at the source, and that is through I would call it root and branch reform of the Fed. We need to get them out of the money printing business. The 2% inflation target is ridiculous. We need to get back to something that resembles sound money. if we're ever going to correct our badly, bleeding current account and trade account with the rest of the world.
And of course, if Donald Trump could have his way, he would just be lowering the interest rates. But we'll get to that a little bit later. I do have a question for you specifically on tariff revenue. And this might be a nerdier question and a little bit less in the policy of some of the things that Donald Trump's getting wrong. So I took this out of everyone should subscribe to your Substack, but I took this from one of the recent ones. And
Yeah.
it is similar to what you just said, but the line was, to be sure, given the nation's current fiscal disaster, we don't object to a uniform 10% or even 20% tariff in lieu of consumption tax on important goods, but it should be applied evenly to all 3.5 trillion of U.S. imports per year on goods originating anywhere on the planet. So my question for you in terms of, I guess, tariff revenue being a good thing, it's a two-part question. First is, I guess I get concerned with, does government actually have any money coming in that it doesn't spend? So the pitch is, hey, we're going to bring in this money from tariff revenue, and so now we're not going to have to tax you guys on your income. But I don't know, it just strikes me like the Social Security scam of, hey, save your money with us, and we're not going to spend it, which of course they raided all of the Social Security funds. And then also just on the concept of a consumption tax being better than an income tax. And maybe I just have this wrong, and I know I read your piece that kind of takes on the Laffer curve, but isn't it just a tax on production? Like if I'm bringing in raw goods from another country and I want to go ahead and make goods, aren't you just disincentivizing a company from engaging in production slash taking money away from a company that might invest it better than if you tax it and hand it over to the government? So I guess I'm just like curious on the concept of, if we had to get rid of a tax, we'd be better off with a tariff tax because it's viewed as more of a consumption tax. But I guess in my head, I just see it more of a tax on a company's production.
Yeah, well, in theory, all taxes are bad. Okay, so we ought to start with that proposition. But on the other hand, whether we like it or not, the political consensus in the United States that has congealed over decades and decades, really since the New Deal, uh, federal spending was 3% of GDP prior to the New Deal, and now it's 24%. And so the problem is spending, and you need to chisel that down as far as you possibly can. But the honest, realistic fact is that they went through this whole process in Congress. The Republicans are in control of both chambers. They passed the big, beautiful bill. And if you look at the baseline spending, it's now about 7 trillion by 2034, which is the 10-year window, 10 years out. Under existing policy, it would have been 10.3 trillion. So that's a huge growth in spending that needed to be attacked. But guess how much the big beautiful bill reduces that growth from 7 trillion today to 10.3 trillion 10 years out? The answer is it doesn't. It actually adds, unbelievably, it adds to the baseline spending because there's more money for defense, and we already have a swamp of waste at the DOD of $1 trillion a year. It adds more money for border control when border control isn't the real issue. It's the failed immigration quota system that ought to be addressed. And it adds enormously to the debt service, which is already soaring because the debt keeps building year after year, and we're now chasing our tail with interest rates having to adjust upward and the debt continuing to grow. And I think this is important for viewers to just focus on. If 2019 wasn't that long ago, fiscal 2019, a few years back. At that time, we were paying about 350 billion a year in net interest on the Treasury debt outstanding. The year underway right now, we will pay 1.1 trillion in interest. So it's almost tripled in the last few years. One, because we added so much to the debt during all of this, COVID and pandemic spendathons that we had in the stimmy bills signed by pushed by both parties. Trump's was 2 trillion, Biden's was 2 trillion. It was all, totally out of control. But as a result of that, we're now up to a trillion a year in interest. But by the end of 2034, without any change in policy, it would have been 2 trillion. And what did the Congress do? What did Trump do? What did the Republicans do? They didn't change spending by a dime. They added 5 trillion to the deficit owing to lower revenue. And as a result of that, we're going to be well above 10.3 trillion in spending 10 years down the road. It only gets worse after that. So I agree you need to attack the spending monster, but where we are right now is spending seems to be locked in, even with the blessing of Donald Trump and the so-called fiscally conservative party, the Republicans. It's locked in at roughly 24% of GDP. And if you take the tax level that we now have as a result of the big beautiful bill being enacted, and the 2017 tax cut being extended permanently, and all of these new tax relief measures, added, no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax for most people on Social Security. You can deduct your interest on your auto loan. All these things that were added basically shove the revenue take to its lowest level in modern times, even lower than it was when I was there with Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s. It's under 17% of GDP. So now, to get us back to your opening question about tariff revenues, when you have a gap that's permanent and that grows over time due to interest, the interest debt cycle compounding, when you have a gap from 24% of GDP in spending to 17% or under in taxes, you got to do something. Okay. And I would prefer a value added tax, which would get at the problem you raised initially here, because in a value added tax, if you're buying, let's say, semi finished parts or sub assemblies or even raw material, in a value added tax, that gets passed forward and you don't pay a tax on it. It ends up ultimately as a tax on final consumption. And I think if we could get to a value added tax and only tax final consumption, then your point that it's a tax on production would be alleviated. It would be a far preferable tax if we taxed final consumption through a value added mechanism than the income tax, which today is so loaded on the top 10% and the top 1% of producers in our society that we really can't get any more revenue out of it. I mean, that lemon has been totally squeezed. The top 1% is already paying 45% of income taxes. The top 10% is already paying 70 to 75%. The bottom 50% either doesn't pay any income taxes at all, or a very low amount. It averages about 7% of adjusted gross income. So what I'm saying is the income tax is already utterly imbalanced, tapped out, and very unfair to the highest producers if you use income as a measure of production, contribution to economic society activity, and I think it's fair. So we've already overused the income tax. We need to have some revenue. I would say most of the gap should be closed by spending, but realistically, we just went through the numbers. You're not going to get there. So at the end of the day, we're going to need more revenue. Value added would be the way to go, or even a national sales tax. Neither of those will ever pass in a month of Sundays because the Democrats will scream, it's unfair to the poor, it's unfair to the working man, it's unfair to the middle class, and so forth. So you end up with the third best option, okay? Not a value added tax, not a national sales tax, but kind of a backdoor consumption tax in the form of a uniform across the board 10 or 20% tariff where you and I started a few minutes ago. Now, that is one thing. But Trump is really trying to do something else. He's trying to macro manage the entire 30 trillion GDP through, daily announcements on tariffs about which he changes his mind practically every day, and which is different for every single country in the world, of which there are about 180 that we trade with, and about which he changes his mind constantly. That's why we call him the Taco Man. Taco Man now. Trump always chickens out. Okay, he sets all these deadlines. You get up to it, the stock market falls apart. He gets nervous. He says, "We'll give you another 90 days." Everybody's confused. You can't run an economy based on a guy in the Oval Office sliding around by the seat of his ample breeches, making it up as he goes on economic theories which are nonsense. It is not, our trade problem, our weak economy problem, our lack of good jobs problem is not due to high tariffs abroad or unfair practices. And I want to give you just one number. If we take the top, let's go to the 2024. That's the most recent year. Trade data that we have available with the world. And if we take the top 34 trade partners that we have, the EU, which is 27 countries, China, Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, India, Canada, and Mexico. That's the essence. Those 34 countries are the essence of the global economy. Last year, we exported 1.5 trillion to these countries. We imported 2.6 trillion from these same countries. We had a $1.1 trillion deficit with the big 34 countries from Japan all the way over to the EC and our neighbors in Canada and Mexico. Now, the issue that I'm raising is, if we ask the question, what do you think the average tariff is that our exporters of that 1.5 trillion to all these countries around the world, from Japan to Canada, what do you think the average tariff that all these countries charged on the 1.5 trillion? Well, the answer, it's 5%, 5.0% to be very exact. Now, if we look at the 2.6 trillion of imports that came in from all these countries, that according to Trump are totally unfair, that created this 1.1 trillion a year deficit on our trade account, what do you suppose our weighted average tariff was on all of that incoming import? Well, the answer is 5.1%. In other words, there is not a dime's worth of difference in the tariff rates that our exporters face with the overwhelming share of our import partners, our trade partners from China all the way to Mexico, than what we levy on their goods as they come in. It is not a tariff problem. Then, of course, you got these characters in the White House, the protectionists in the White House, who say, "Well, yeah, there's tariffs. That's unfair to begin with, but the real problem is non-tariff barriers." Well, what do you mean by that? Well, a government subsidizes production or investment or export, or you have national policies. In other words, you can government agencies can only buy from national producers, not from suppliers abroad and so forth. Okay, well, you can take that, but if you look at non-tariff barriers, the United States is probably the worst offender in the entire global market. The entire tech industry is subsidized to the tune of hundreds of billions by the DoD and the national security apparatus. That's where a huge amount of risk capital comes from, as well as ongoing cash flow. We have Buy America policies from the state capitals all the way to Washington that add up to 800 billion a year. In other words, there is 800 billion of procurement by governments in the US at all levels that say only you can only buy from American producers. You can't buy from the EU, you can't buy from Mexico, you can't certainly buy from China and so forth. Anyway, I don't want to overly belabor it, but the point is if you dig into the so-called non-tariff barriers, there's a lot of unfair trade in the world because no governments are going to let things, the free market, work entirely. But it's not unbalanced. We're pretty unfair. They are somewhat unfair. But that isn't why we have $1 trillion deficit in trade in the most recent year between our big trade partners who send us 2.5 trillion and our exporters who ship out 1.5 trillion. The reason for that huge gap, and it's been there for years and decades, is the Fed has inflated the bejesus, as I said, out of the US economy. And if we want to fix this problem, we have got to have root and branch reform at the Fed and get them off this pro inflation kick. When you're competing with low wage countries, like, the average hourly manufacturing wage in China is $9 an hour. Okay. The average hourly manufacturing wage in the US, and this is fully loaded for benefits, healthcare and payroll taxes and so forth, is $40 an hour. So when you have that big a gap, the last thing we need in the United States is even more inflation, another 2% a year, or right now it's 3%, it was 7%. The Fed ought to be pursuing, if anything, disinflation, deflation, not inflation. So that gets to the heart of the trade imbalance, the trade deficit, the offshoring of the American economy. They're pursuing the right problem with completely the wrong policies and tools.
All right, so a lot there. Just to kind of give
Yeah,
I guess, a very short recap. We don't like Donald Trump engaging in central planning and the economy
correct.
kind of being at his whims and his attitudes and the random information that he seems to get. Tariffs are not a great tool for bringing back manufacturing to the U.S., but they are from a pragmatic standpoint. They're a decent tool for trying to bring down some of the government spending deficit, which is a massive problem. All right, so let's take a look at the next thing I wanted to just take a look at with tariffs, which is I've got a short video here from Donald Trump where he's basically saying letters went out, and since the letters have gone out, that means that the deals have been made. So I'm going to play this, and then we're going to take a look at where we are even with the current tariffs.
Part I'm very happy with the letters. The letters are a deal. I can't explain it any better. The letters are a deal. The press doesn't want to pick that up. But I will veer from those deals on occasion when somebody is willing. Like if Japan would open up their country. They don't do that. They just don't do that. And I don't either. I don't subscribe to it one way or the other. But they won't do that. So we might just stick with the letter.
All right, so as you pointed out, we're rigging the game as well when it comes to our government, propping up our local industries, and so that's, baloney over there. But Donald Trump basically sent out all these letters, and he goes, hey, deals are in place. What do you see coming next? Do you think we're going to have China had good leverage to go, hey, I'm not going to send you our critical minerals then if you guys are going to tariff us at this level? Do you think other countries are going to start to tariff us back? Do you think they're just going to accept Donald Trump's new levels? What's kind of your expectation of, the letters that went out and whether or not people are going to come and negotiate taking down, their levels, or people are going to strike back at us?
Well, those letters are not deals. I mean, let's be practical here. Those letters are pie in the sky. Those letters are the ask, and of course, the art of the deal approach of Donald Trump is, ask for 100 and maybe you'll get five. Well, okay, so let's put all those letters aside. We had Liberation Day on April 2nd. He gave the world 90 days, 184 countries, 90 days to come to the table. he laid out in precise detail the reciprocal tariff that would apply to every one of these countries, ranging from 10% to 150% if they didn't comply. Well, the 90 days is come and gone. The shoe didn't fall because everything was deferred and people were given more time. But let me say, what have we gotten so far? After all of that huffing and puffing and all of these threats, we've got two deals so far, two deals. One with the UK, and we already had a trade surplus with the United Kingdom. Of the one country in the world, or maybe two or three, but the one major industrial economy in the world that we had a surplus with, he got a deal on, and it doesn't amount to a hill of beans. Okay, I wouldn't even bore the audience with going through how they opened up their beef quota to 10,000 pounds of beef a year. I mean, it's a rounding error nonsense to begin with. So we had one deal with someone we didn't need a deal on. And the other deal we made was with Vietnam, and they said they didn't even agree to it. But let's just give the White House the benefit of the doubt. They said Vietnam agreed because there's a huge trade deficit with Vietnam. If you want to hear some startling numbers, in 2024, we exported all of 13 billion, nothing, a rounding error, to Vietnam. We imported 137 billion, so there was 125 billion trade deficit with Vietnam alone. But that wasn't due to the fact that that they have tariff barriers. Their tariff is about equal to ours, a few percentage points. Both countries have relatively low tariffs. The problem is the wage rate, average fully loaded wage rate in Vietnam is $3 an hour. And the average fully loaded wage rate, as I said before, in the United States is $40 an hour. That's the reason there's this huge deficit. And what happened was last time in Trump 1.0, the attack was on China because of their labor advantage, and what the tariffs that were implied. Because the average tariff on goods coming in from China now is 21%. We apply a weighted average tariff of 21%. It was 2 or 3% when Trump got into office the first time in 2017. Well, what happened? The world doesn't stand still. Markets work even in communist countries. And so quite quickly, a lot of production migrated a few hundreds of miles south from the export production factories of China to Vietnam. So the shoes went there, the sheets went there, the shirts went there, the socks went there, and a lot of basic, electronic assembly. So that's why the deficit just moved in part out of China and into Vietnam. What kind of deal is that? It's not going to change anything when the fundamental problem is huge cost differences. Putting a 20% tariff, on Vietnam, which is it's the only deal I might say here. It's the only actual deal that they've publicly announced from the White House. And again, just to remind everyone, even then, Vietnam has said we don't accept that entirely. But let's take it as it is. On an $8 shirt that you might buy, in Target or Walmart, I mean, $8 cost. I mean, the price might be double or triple that. But on an $8 landed cost of a shirt from Vietnam, you're going to put on a 20% tariff. That's $1.20. But look at the cost difference when it comes to making that shirt. There's about $2 of that $8 of landed cost is labor. If you tried to make it in the United States, there would be $20 of labor. Okay, so the tariff of $1.20 isn't going to compensate in any way, shape, or form for a $20 cost gap when it comes to something as simple as a plain collared shirt that you might find on the shelves at Walmart. So again, to get to the heart of your question, there aren't any deals happening. As I say, UK didn't need one. That was gilding the lily, and Vietnam is a non-deal, both in content as well as what's coming from the other side. Now, there's still 190 countries in the world. The EC is that's grinding away. Trump last time allegedly said he solved the problem with Mexico and Canada. Those are our biggest trading partners, and we have huge deficits with both of those. 172 billion a year with Mexico and 65 billion a year with Canada. That was 2024. But remember, the big deal last time was that uh, Trump denounced the old, Canadian U.S. free trade agreement, NAFTA, replaced it with some, new. He called it the U.S. Canada Mexico deal. That went into effect in 2019. 5 years later, we still had $200 billion worth of trade deficits with Mexico and Canada, even though there's no there are no tariffs or other material unfair trade barriers in what is essentially a free trade environment. So just think about that. He says he's going to make, the art of the deal, the greatest deal maker, to come down the pike since sliced bread. The one area in world trade where he's made a big noisy deal, the Canada-U.S. trade agreement, produced $200 billion worth of trade deficits 5 years later. So he has no idea what he's doing. I mean, he's just a guy who is in love with this idea of tariffs because it's the one thing he can do unilaterally, and that's another whole thing. Why the president should have this much open-ended power just to stumble around and say, Mexico, we're going to put a tariff on you because too much fentanyl is coming in, or Canada, or the other day he attacked. He attacked the BRIC countries because they're suggesting they might not use the dollar. So he says, okay, I'll put a 10% tariff or 20% tariff, I can't remember which it was, on the BRICS unless they straighten out, shape up, and keep using the dollar. I mean, where does the authority for that come from? Well, there is an open-ended act called the Emergency Trade Act of 1977, which apparently is the statutory source for this crazy stumbling around, using tariffs for foreign policy. Let's just not forget everything that's coming across the radar screen, because it's so crazy from day to day that you can lose track. But since he doesn't seem to be making a lot of headway negotiating with Putin on the Ukraine, for reasons we don't need to get into here, he said, well, I'll give you, I don't remember how many days it was now, 30 days or 50 days, I guess it was. And if we don't have a deal, I'm going to put 100% tariff on anybody that Russia trades with. Well, that's the rest of the world. So you're going to basically harm our trading partners around the world who buy American exports by putting 100% tariff on the goods we buy from them, because they're not playing ball according to Donald Trump's wisdom in helping him get Putin to make a deal. I mean, this is mindless. This is insane, and I don't know how long rational adult people in Washington and in the financial markets are going to put up with this. But someone has to say the emperor is naked. Okay, the trade czar who's stumbling around in the Oval Office is totally out of control. He's out of his mind. He's using, in other words, the commerce of the United States And of all of the workers who work in export industries or import impacted industries, all of the investors who are invested in companies like Caterpillar that export, or the tech industries that are big exporters, that everybody in that whole massive part of our commerce with the rest of the world is at the beck and call of Donald Trump in the Oval Office to do exactly what he orders in order to accomplish something that is utterly unrelated to what they're trying to do in daily life, which is sell something, make a profit, make a wage, remain competitive. It is totally wrong for the state, for the government, for Washington, for the Oval Office to take over the commerce of the people in order to accomplish objectives that may be good, bad, or indifferent. You can say fentanyl is a bad thing. I agree it is, but the drug wars failed totally. And I don't think we ought to be taking American trade hostage because certain chemical precursors are being sold by China, which some other bad guys in Mexico compound and formulate and sell here because we've made the price of heroin so high. It is really it's a bad scene to be using the commerce of the people of America to conduct a war with Putin, to conduct a trade war with China, to conduct a drug war on this or that unfavored drug at the moment. That isn't the way liberty is supposed to work. That isn't the way prosperity based on free markets happens. So when you talk about how bad the Democrats are, and they're really bad, I don't have any illusions about that. I started on Capitol Hill in 1970, so I understand how bad the Democrats are. They haven't changed; they've only gotten worse. But when you start to talk about how bad they are on these fundamental questions, let's ask what we're doing right now. We have a Republican government that has added 55 trillion to the public debt over the next 30 years. That's what was in this big beautiful bill. 55 trillion more on top of the 130 trillion that was already built in. We have a Republican government that is basically putting the entire trade sector, which is about 18% of GDP, under the thumb of the government, but actually of a wannabe king of trade in the Oval Office. This isn't conservative. This isn't sound. This isn't going to get us anywhere near the promised land of a new golden era of prosperity. It's going to get us into a demolition derby in which the government wrecks what's left of the free enterprise, free market prosperity that we still have in the United States.
That's such an interesting point because Donald Trump's whole pitch, in a way, is these people are screwing us and I'm going to exert our leverage. So, like on the fentanyl thing, hey, look at what China's doing. They're killing some of our people. I'm going to exert our leverage. But that's such an interesting way to put it of like, you have no right to risk the labor or our economy. That's not supposed to be in the power of the president, and it could be detrimental because you're taking unnecessary risks. I hadn't quite thought of it in that way. You had mentioned Brics there, and so I had pulled this up because I know you had also written an article about this. But you got Trump threatening 10% tariffs for nations that are even exploring the Brics option. So I guess two-part question of is the Brics actually a threat to the U.S. dollar, and is it helpful to the American economy to even want to take on that threat?
Well, this is another whole, issue that has drifted off into left field. The idea that, well, the dollar is the reserve currency of the world is in danger, and therefore we have to protect it. That's all a lot of baloney. There is no real reserve currency in the world anymore because we don't have, when the dollar was anchored to gold and we had redeemable dollars that if push came to shove, at least other countries could turn their dollars in for gold. That was one thing. The dollar was a reserve currency under that scheme because it basically said to the world, well, if you don't want to, go to the trouble of holding bullion, the bulk gold in bullion form, you can use dollars because the United States will never waver in its commitment to redeem the dollar at a fixed rate against gold. That was $35 an ounce. Okay, that is long gone. That disappeared in 1971 at Camp David when Nixon basically pulled the plug on the gold standard and on the Bretton Woods system. And since then, we've had a floating rate system. Well, in a floating rate world, exchange rate, I mean, the rates change by the hour, by the second. As we're talking right here, you could just look up and watch a ticker moving away on any currency pair with the dollar. You don't need a reserve currency anymore because reserves were basically a reserve currency was just a substitute form of gold. The idea that the dollar is a reserve currency is actually a misnomer, which hides the fact that dollars are held by central banks around the world in large amounts. Okay, and it's about 4% of world GDP right now, which is 4 or 5 trillion of federal debt held by foreign central banks. But they hold that because they've engaged in currency manipulation. In other words, we've flooded the world with so many dollars that if the true free market that Milton Friedman wanted in 1971 when he told Nixon pull the plug on gold, if we had a true free market, the exchange rate of Japan would have gone way the hell higher than it is today. The exchange rate of the RMB in China would be double or triple its current level in terms of strength because the dollar would have gone down and the surplus country currencies would have appreciated. Well, none of the central banks wanted to allow that to happen because it's just like trade politics here. Their export industry screamed out loud, no, you can't do that to us. If our exchange rate goes up, we'll lose, another 2% or 5% or 10% of our exports. And so therefore you need to make sure that this weakening dollar doesn't undermine our export markets. And so they all intervened. And they bought hand over fist dollars in the currency market, parked those dollars in U.S. Treasury bills and notes and bonds, and they built up on their balance sheet. And that's what they call reserves today. But those aren't reserves in the traditional proper sense of the word. Those are just the results of central bank conducted dirty floats and currency manipulation. So we don't need that. The way to solve that problem is to tell the Fed stop printing any more money. The Fed's balance sheet, people wouldn't realize this, but when Nixon pulled the plug, the Fed's balance sheet was only 50 billion. Okay, and at a recent peak, as we all know, before they finally had to crack down on the printing press because inflation hit 40-year highs. At the peak in 2022, the balance sheet of the Fed was 9 trillion. In other words, it went from 50 billion to 9 trillion, over that period of time. And that's what caused the rest of the central banks of the world to act defensively, buying up dollars and creating these reserves. So the whole thing is a phony argument, but in the short run, the idea that if we keep flooding the market with dollars, they'll be forced to intervene, and doing so, they buy Treasury securities, and the Treasury securities help us finance the deficit uh, it's really a pretty bad, unsustainable idea. It's basically taking foreign central banks hostage to buy treasury debt because we can't stop spending and borrowing. So there's a whole big circle here where the Fed prints the money, it floods the world, the dollar weakens, the foreign central banks intervene, they buy up the dollars go into treasury securities, the treasury securities purchase helps keep the interest rate down. Everybody thinks this is a wonderful system, but how long can you keep doing that before the whole thing comes unraveled?
So, and I think part of it is if they actually move forward with BRICS, it might help the United States because it would put an end to our constant ability to basically fund the deficit and export the inflation. And so it might actually poke at Washington a little bit of, hey, there is.
It would help, actually. No, no, no. It would actually help because it would just be another wake up call to Washington. If you reach the point now where the Fed has shut down the printing press, they're no longer buying bonds. In fact, they're allowing their existing holdings to run off as bonds and notes and bills mature. So they're basically in what's called QT, quantitative tightening. They're shrinking their balance sheet. They have shrunk it from 9 trillion to 7 trillion. Of course, it started at the time of the financial crisis at only 900 billion. So, we got a long way to go. But the key point is with inflation still kind of stuck now, plateaued at 3% plus, the Fed is still allowing the Treasury debt to run off and therefore its holdings to shrink. So they're not buying up the bonds anymore. That's my point. They're actually adding to the supply in the market when they allow redeeming bonds to expire. And at the same time, the foreign central banks are increasingly reluctant to take on even more dollars in that environment. And the BRICS want to move off the dollar and into other their own currencies or other arrangements, multilateral arrangements that they could make within their own group. So the artificial bid, which came from central banks here, the Fed, and foreign central banks, may be drying up, which means if you're going to borrow 3 trillion a year, which is what the big beautiful bill mandates, that's what you get. You implement, he signed the big beautiful bill. Now it's going to go into implementation, execution. It's going to borrow 3 trillion a year. But now you won't have the Fed buying the debt, and you won't have the foreign central banks buying the debt, and you may even have some central banks in the BRIC alignment actually selling treasury debt they have as they shift to another system. Then you're going to be in an environment where the meager savings rate of the U.S. economy has to fund this exploding and relentlessly rising treasury issuance to fund the current deficits. Now, that may bring the law of supply and demand into play. That is, the supply of treasury debt to be purchased will continue rising, and the available demand to fund it will be dramatically reduced compared to what we've known for the last 20 or 30 years, when the central banks basically did the job. Between the treasuries, between the Fed's balance sheet going, roughly from the turn of the century, where it was 500 billion to 9 trillion, they sopped up about 8 trillion, let's say in round numbers, of treasury debt. Foreign central banks sopped up another 4 or 5 trillion. And so that was upwards of half of all the new debt that was created. In other words, it wasn't purchased by honest investors who cared about the rate of return, which investors have to do. It was purchased by governments who had totally different objectives in mind. The foreign governments to keep their exchange rate down. The rogue bank, central bank we have here in the Eccles building, the Federal Reserve, to conduct its notion of Keynesian monetary policy. That was totally artificial. And yet, that's why we ended up, you can look at the charts, you'll see that if you take the 30-year Treasury, which is kind of the true long bond, the measure of the longest, duration that you can find in quantity in the market. If you go back to 1982, when Volcker was just getting us out of the horrendous inflation of the 1970s, the yield on the long bond was 15.2%. I mean, that's a lot, right? 15.2%. When we got down to the bottom of the cycle in March 2022, and I think it's a very important date, you got to put a sticker on it. You got to put a pin on it. March 2022 is when the Fed finally cried uncle and said, oops, inflation isn't transitory and it's not a good thing. It's running at 7, 8, 9%, depending on how you measure it. And they shut down finally the printing press in March 2022. Well, the yield was 1.2%. It's startling. The yield on the 30-year, you were issuing debt with a 30-year life at a time when the inflation rate was 3 or 4% that had a coupon of 1.2%. Insane. So over that 40-year period, the yield marched downhill from 15.2 to 1.2, which means 1,400 basis points continuously marching downhill, where everybody was living happily ever after because the Treasury was issuing unlimited debt and the private sector was experiencing lower and lower and lower interest rates. And of course, the corollary of the interest rate is higher PEs, that is, stock prices. So the stock market was happy. Borrowers in the private sector were happy. The government was borrowing and spending like there was no tomorrow. And that's the 40 years from 1982 to 2022. Now, where are we at this moment if you were actually to look at a screen for the bond market? Well, the long bond is the 30-year is now over 5. It pierced the 5.0% level, I think, a couple of days ago. So we're marching in the other direction now. In other words, the 40-year long march downhill, totally engineered by central banks that were freed from the discipline of the gold standard, reached the point of failure because inflation was about ready to become, horrendous, and have had to reverse direction and reverse policy. Now we're going back uphill, and just Katie bar the door, because when you have 30 trillion outstanding of Treasury debt right now, and that's held by the public, it's 37 trillion overall. And you're going to be adding 2 to 3 trillion a year to that pile. And the rate is going up. And all the front runners are now beginning to think, well, maybe owning the long bond isn't so smart after all. I mean, if you owned the long bond, if you could create an artificial construct, it wouldn't be that hard to do. And say you bought the long bond in 1982, actually July 1982, at 15.2, and you rode it all the way down to 1.2 in March 20, you would have made insane amounts of money. Okay, but now the opposite is happening. We've already marched from 1.2 to 5, and it could easily go to 7 and 8, 10. And when you have as much debt outstanding as we have, and the yields are now marching back uphill because the central banks are out of the market, I think you got a totally different ballgame.
All right, I got 2 more. Well, actually, I had 3, but we're going to cut one, and I apologize if I keep you a little bit over time. But as we're talking about inflation here, so you kind of have 2 conflicting reports, and I do think it somewhat ties into tariffs. People are expecting, or there was chatter that tariffs would push up prices. So you're starting to see reports of an increase in the inflation rate. And at the same time, you've got Donald Trump making claims. This is reported in Newsweek. Consumer prices low, bring down the Fed rate now. And then I saw this retweeted from Unusual Whales. This was from, I believe, July 9th. A new study by the Council of Economic Advisors, led by highly respected chair Dr. Stephen Mirren, has found tariffs had zero impact on inflation. In fact, the study shows that import prices are actually dropping, just like I also said they would. The fake news and the so-called experts were wrong again. So first is, and then last, we'll take a look at what Donald Trump is trying to do with interest rates and Powell. But I'm curious on the topic of inflation. One, the administration seems to like to declare victory early, and I'm a little bit confused because the initial round of tariffs seemed to have gotten thrown out because he did them across the board. They said that that was illegal, and that's why he started sending out letters to every single individual country. So it seems to me, and maybe I just have the story wrong here, we're kind of really at the beginning of the Donald Trump tariff policy, except for the short duration of time that there was high tariffs on China. So why would we even have seen a price increase from what he'd done before for them to be claiming victory over, a price increase because of the tariff strategy? I don't really remember that we had high tariffs up until this round of letters going out. And I guess just beyond that. So firstly, the administration seems to want to declare, hey, look, everyone was saying, tariffs are going to increase prices. They haven't. I don't really know how there would be proof of that already. Is part one. And then part two is, what's your kind of expectation for inflation at the moment?
Yeah, well, these are all good points, but first I would say wait till Christmas. By the time we get to Christmas, you're going to see prices for a lot of things higher. That's the first point, because it takes a while to work through the system. The tariffs are not being paid by some guy in a factory in China. I'm sorry. They're being paid by importers. Importers, whether they're a big operation like Walmart or whether they're middlemen selling to other retailers, are doing their best to try to navigate the situation that they face. But in time, they're either going to go out of business, or their profit margins are going to be destroyed, or they're going to have to raise prices. And they can, because the reason the imports are coming in from Vietnam of sheets and shirts is that's the cheapest sheet and shirt you can find in the world. So it's not that, you're going to come to some supplier in South Carolina who's suddenly going to deliver to you the $8 shirt that was coming out of Vietnam. You may resource because you're so uncertain about trade, and you don't know what the tariff man in the Oval Office is going to do, but you're going to pay $16 or $20 or $25 for the shirt that you're going to source for next season from South Carolina, if you can find a mill still in operation. So my first point is there's a lag in all this. It takes time for suppliers, retailers, and importers either to change their pricing for existing imported commodities now paying tariffs, or to resource to another country. Vietnam's too high. Maybe you try Malaysia or something, or to a domestic supplier. But it's all going to end up in higher prices, because ultimately people are not going to, importers are not going to work for free, or they'll go bankrupt. And the lowest cost suppliers in the world are now supplying the U.S. economy. And if you move away from the Vietnam and the China, or even South Korea for that matter, you're going to move to higher cost suppliers. There are no Vietnams left. In other words, we found the cheapest labor in the world. It was in the jungles that got defoliated in the 1960s and 70s by Washington. So that's the first point. The second point is that the tariffs will cause over time price levels for imported goods to rise, and that will be inflation, cumulative inflation. It may, if the Fed doesn't accommodate the upward pressure on prices for imported goods, toys, shirts, shoes, electronics, TV sets, etc., laptops, desktops, If the Fed doesn't accommodate that by easing again, and I don't think they're in a position to do that, then demand will shift in part away from imported goods, if there's any elasticity, price elasticity, towards more services or lower cost domestic or other domestically produced goods, or there will be a reduction in purchases of domestic services in order for consumers to pay out of the same paycheck for the higher cost of shoes, shirts, TV sets, and everything else, toys that's being brought in on imports and being charged these higher tariffs. In either event, it doesn't improve prosperity. It just mucks up the economy. It causes consumption to shift from one thing to the other. And over time, it will raise the price level, and that's inflation. One more point. The idea that inflation is whatever the June CPI was is really not true. That was the rate of change for 1 month, and there's all kinds of foibles and noise and revisions in these numbers. But inflation really is a cumulative rise in the price level over time. And so, therefore, a year from now, 2 years from now, if we have 3% inflation for the next decade, the price level will be 34% higher. That's what the inflation is. It wasn't, necessarily the 3% annual rate in any given month. The final point is that if you don't cherry pick even the monthly data, which I think is mostly noise, the running inflation rate measured by a good measure that I use called the 16% trim mean CPI, which is basically a smoothed version of the consumer price index that each month takes out the highest 8% and the lowest 8% of items in a multi-thousand market basket. But unlike the CPI less food and energy, which is the same, half index every month, and people use food, they use energy, obviously. The trim mean CPI drops the high and low items every month, and they're different ones. So on a smooth over time basis, you count everything, and you get like a smooth statement each month of the rate of change on an annual or even monthly basis. Now, having said all that, here's what the answer is. The June trim mean CPI came in at 3.17% higher than a year ago. The monthly rate of change was 4%. The monthly rate of change has been all over the lot because it bounces up and down, even with the smoothing technique, because that's the way indices work. But it's been everywhere from 2 to 5% over the last year, but it's averaging 3.17, let's call it 3.2% to round. Well, I would say that's not evidence of no inflation. 3%, as I said, 3% in a decade, your purchasing power is down by 34%. That's something. So you really can't run a 3% inflation policy. You shouldn't be running a 2% inflation policy, to tell you the truth. But the idea that you see in all these quotes in social media posts you get from the Donald is there's no inflation. Well, that's baloney. He took 1 month, he took the rate of change in the CPI in June, the headline CPI, it was 0.1. He multiplied times 12, got a little over 1% on an annual basis, and said, see, there's no inflation. Well, what someone should have said, but Mr. President, in the same, in the same press room at the White House when he was spewing that nonsense, they could have said, well, in January, the annualized rate of the headline CPI in January is 5.2%, and in all the months in between, it's been all over the lot, up and down. So what do you mean that there's no inflation? There's been, that's why we have to look at like a year over year rate, and we need to look at something like the trim mean CPI. And if we look at that one, and it's pretty reliable and it's pretty stable, and it doesn't get all the monthly noise distortions up or down involved, it's 3+%. And that's bad. That's not sustainable. That's not good inflation. It's unfair to a lot of people who don't have a 3% growth in their paycheck every
So
month.
I have to ask, if we shelve what we said at the beginning of the episode of tariffs might be good for increasing some revenue and bringing down our overall deficit, and we just wanted to look at United States manufacturing jobs and inflation. So this is just kind of a theoretical. If Donald Trump didn't work out a single other deal and we just had our deal in place with Vietnam of, the 20% tariff over there,
Yeah,
manufacturing in Vietnam is still going to be cheaper than bringing the jobs back over here. And let's say it didn't work out a single other deal, so that you end up with more manufacturing in Vietnam, and then you got a 20% tariff, so prices, some of that's going to get passed on to the consumers. So
sure,
essentially, you got a
sure.
framework here where you don't end up with a single additional U.S. job, and you've got some sort of an increase in the pricing, so you have no jobs and more inflation. Like there's really no way around it.
Yeah, I think that's right. You'll have no job gains, really. You'll have higher prices for some things, probably lower prices for a couple of other things. The lower prices will be since people need the sheets, they need the shirts, they need the
You're going to
shoes.
buy less
Okay,
seamless,
they
you're going to take
probably
less
even
Ubers, and it's just going to hit the people who had
well,
American jobs.
yeah. So the Uber drivers are going to have an income decrement, but also, services generally. You're going to spend less on services, but all of the decrement to offset the higher cost of the shirts and the sheets and the shoes is basically domestically produced services. Okay, so domestically produced service jobs will decline relative to where they would have otherwise been, or incomes will decline because the poor guy who's a shoe repairman or the guy who's in the dry cleaners is going to have to cut his prices if he's going to retain
I mean,
demand. So
it's such a hilariously bad
it's
policy
stupid.
because the jobs
It's
that exist
stupid.
here, which
It's
are the
just
service jobs, are just going to make less money so that you can spend
yeah,
more
yeah.
jobs for the manufacturing stuff you're still going to have to import.
Well, we got 160 million jobs. There's 12 million in manufacturing. All the rest of them, most of the rest of them are either in government or service or hotels and restaurants and, on down the line. So the whole thing is just idiotic. Okay, that's Trumponomics. It's pure idiocy every way. He wants easier money when we need a sound dollar. He wants to increase the deficit when it's already out of control. He wants to monkey around with the free enterprise economy by becoming the trade czar of the world, which will backfire in 100 different ways. And then finally, he wants to deport all of the 8 million workers who are here illegally, allegedly, but they're working every day, drawing a paycheck, paying taxes, because that was the only way they could get here. In other words, if we had a proper quota for low skill workers, it's only 10,000 a year. If we had a proper quota of 500,000 or a million, there wouldn't be any illegals. There wouldn't be any illegal workers here. They would be legal. Okay. So he's going to deport workers that we need. The native born workforce is shrinking because, and that's, you don't even have to take my word for that. Uh, there are going to be no native born growth of native born workers in the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, because they haven't been born, because the birth rate is already of native born American or women has already collapsed. So we already know from the iron law of demographics that the workforce going into the 2030s is shrinking. And if we're now going to send all the illegal workers here home, oh yeah, get rid of the criminals. There's 10 or 20,000. It's no big deal. But if you focused on the criminals and stop raiding, Home Depots and chicken butchering plants in the middle of the night, if you could at least, but that's what he's doing. So at the same time that he's inflating the demand in the economy through money printing and more debt, He's shrinking the supply of workers and goods through trade protectionism and worker deportations. That is the worst combination that anybody in the history of modern economics has ever come up with. 2 points to shrink supply, two anti supply side positions, 2 points to artificially inflate demand through money printing and treasury borrowing. And you put the two together, and it's, as I say, it's a demolition derby when it comes to the future of prosperity in the United States.
All right. You told me I had two more questions I wanted to ask. I don't know if we're going over time. You want to shelve them for another
Yeah, I
episode?
think we're we're getting there. Yeah, let's save it for the next time.
Okay, I'll have to send one of the videos your day because maybe we'll even do a piece out of it. But one of them was just Donald Trump talking about how we're spending too much on our debt and that's why we need to be lowering our interest rates. And I just think it's
Yeah,
just so
right.
cartoonish that he thinks there's endless money for that to work. But David, this was an absolute pleasure. Thank you, sir, so much for the insights on all these topics. And why don't you just let everyone know where they can follow you, find the Substack, find the books, and all that stuff.
Yeah. Well, I publish a daily Substack. It's called David Stockman's Contra Corner. You can easily find it by Googling it. The kinds of issues that we've been discussing here are what I address every day, depending on what's in the news, what the latest headline or development is. But the whole idea is to put it in context of A, history, and B, sound economics. And if we look at what we're bombarded with by the day right now, there's no history to it. It's as if the world was born yesterday. And, it's based on a lot of uh, politically convenient economics that won't hold up. So that's what I try to do. And we call it David Stockman's Contra Corner because we're kind of contrarian when it comes to the mainstream media view of what people should think or believe.
All right, this was awesome. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.